production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by
Yuletide Office Solutions, locally owned and family operated, offering office supplies and furniture, office design services, school supplies, and more. The Yuletide team proudly supports the Bartlett Area Chamber of Commerce and WKNO.
the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The top stories of 2015 tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining me. I'm joined tonight by Ryan Poe with Commercial Appeal. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for being here. And Burnell Smith from the Tri-State Defender. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you.
So we'll start biggest stories of the year, looking back and kind of how they impact 2016 and what we see. And clearly, I think you have to start with the elections. And your take, I mean, a mayor's race, which is always a big deal. It was a big mayor's race, a lot of candidates, a lot of effort, a surprising outcome for some. And then we can talk about council races later. But your take on the mayor's race and Wharton's loss and Strickland's win?
Yeah, I think there was really sort of a mandate against Wharton. I think he had just found himself very, unpopular, particularly in the black community. And then, of course, there were the other candidates, other African-American candidates that were in the race that sort of provided an alternative. But clearly, based upon those numbers, the outcome was not very hard to predict relative to it.
The disconnect, which was very real in the numbers with the African-American community, I mean, lots of people have talked about that, but what's your take on where that came and why he was never able to really, I mean, he got probably the same, give or take, same percentage of African-American vote as Jim Strickland,
right.
And Jim didn't necessarily work real hard for the African-American vote,
right.
So
Right.
what was that disconnect
Exactly.
and why could he not overcome it?
Well, part of it that I don't think he ever really established a grassroots connection in the community. If you can kind of compare Wharton to Harrington always had that strong grassroots base of voters that were going to support him no matter when he ran or how he ran. He always had that base. Wharton never established that. Then you put on top of that cutting the police and fire benefits and pay, whether that was a necessary ill, and it seemed he took the entire brunt of that decision, and you couple that with a few other mishaps that happened along the way, not to mention right before the election, the whole snafu with the contract with Deidre Malone and the whole 9 yards. I think he just found himself unable to really capture the interest or the support, particularly of the African-American community.
Right. Ryan, I'll put you on the spot. I mean, I guess there were a lot of people following who maybe weren't surprised Wharton lost, but surprised that he lost by 20.
Yeah, that was a big surprise to me personally, but and I think to a lot of people. Because Wharton, he'd won elections by landslides time after time. And so coming into this election to win by 22% for Strickland, and that was just phenomenal for Strickland. So, and that I think that's a testament to just how dissatisfied people were with a number of things, including crime, which was Strickland's big issue. We'll
come and talk about crime because obviously that was a big issue. But Bill, the Strickland campaign, I mean, it's become pretty clear. I don't know if it was written about, I can't quite remember, but they knew they were up, and they knew they were up big in the summer. They knew they were up. They did a second, I think Jim talked about it, Mayor Strickland talked about it on the show when he was here, that they were up by 10 plus. They almost kind of didn't believe it. They did another internal poll, and then they worked. The number one thing I think he said, and people around his campaign said, don't tell anyone we know we're up by this because people won't come out. Whatever you think of Strickland as a candidate, or whatever, he ran an incredibly effective campaign. He said the same thing over and over. So much so that the people, I don't know about you all, but some of us who covered all the time are like, gosh, if he says it one more time, but it was effective. He said the same thing every forum, every speech, every appearance.
Right, and in technical terms of how the campaigns were executed, Strickland was the disciplined candidate. Wharton was the candidate who, while voters may not have known it, Wharton knew he was losing even before that critical last week of the campaign when things kept on blowing up on him in a big way. So it was a disciplined candidacy versus a candidacy where you had an incumbent who was not really comfortable talking about his record. During this campaign, Bass Pro Shops opened at the Pyramid. During the last week of the campaign, HUD awarded the city $30 million as part of this massive South City development project. And then the next day, the city broke ground on the Universal Life Insurance building and its restoration, an important symbol in the city in terms of minority business and minority business growth here. Yet, you had a besieged mayor who, at those events in particular, should have been on top of his game, just coasting along. He was dodging questions about the contract for the Taser body cameras in those last two instances.
Which was kind of ironic because, I mean, at least from a news point of view, Wharton, going back to what you said, Ryan, Wharton had always escaped any kind of whiff of corruption, any kind of whiff. I mean, he'd always been above that. Whatever you thought about his policies, he'd been above it. And it was strange that he got tagged, or I don't know, strange, but unexpected, and maybe spoke to what people said around the mayor's office, that there's just all these good things have happened, but really poor execution and poor communication about some of the good things he's done. And he said at a forum after the election that I was moderating with a bunch of mayors, suburban mayors and so on, he said, I'm paraphrasing, I was never able to connect the fact that the bike lanes going in front of that guy's house, he said, I don't care about those bike lanes, I don't have a job. And Wharton said, I never could communicate that these things we were doing that he felt were really important for the city in the short term and long term were connecting with the people who again, needed a job. And again, I think the other thing that's interesting is that he took office in, 2009? I mean, the heat of the recession.
Right.
And we'll segue into the union and the cuts. The other interesting thing about that I think in hindsight, he never really did a great job of communicating, and it's going to be a huge challenge for Strickland, is if you think those cuts were necessary for the long-term health of the city, you nonetheless have an incredibly demoralized and angry police force. And how Strickland addresses that demoralization and a depleted police force is probably, at least on the government side, one of his biggest challenges, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. 400 officers down, with a number of officers that have already registered for the drop program, if you will, to retire early, and so trying to get back up to the full contingent of officers that's necessary to handle crime in the way that he's seeing, which is really going back to something that Godwin put in place, which was Blue Crush. If that's his goal, he's really going to have to really look at the budget. But to your point, Eric, one of the things that Wharton never really did was to communicate to the community why the budget situation was what it was. You had a great recession, which led to significant foreclosures in Memphis. We even sued Wells Fargo for $150 million, which he never even brought that back to the table in terms of the benefits of that. But you had declining property values, fewer homeowners, fewer taxpayers, which basically, created a lower overall fund for the city. And so trying to figure out how to take care of all these things with less money really was a quintessential issue. Yeah.
We look ahead to the Strickland administration. And I should say we're taping this right before Christmas because of the holidays. So some things may have played out by the time this airs. Your take so far, Ryan, on the administration he's put together. There's some holdovers, maybe some surprising holdovers, a lot, some new faces, and a restructuring of divisions. Your take so far on the Strickland administration?
Yeah. So he is restructuring. He's promoting several people to this leadership team that's going to be reporting directly to the mayor, including substantially police and finance. Yeah. So those two items were reporting to the chief administrative officer before. Now they're reporting directly to the mayor. And I think that speaks to Strickland's priorities. He's going to be focusing a lot on police, a lot on finance. On finance, it is interesting that he kept Brian Collins, who he he clashed a little bit with over the past year
as
over some things.
head of the city council. That was one that really surprised me. I mean, and Brian Collins has been on the show and runs through numbers and has a business background and now a government background. But there was such conflict over these cuts and the budgeting. It did surprise me that Strickland kept Collins in that position.
But you can't forget that Strickland did support those cuts. So you know that, and I think that's why Collins is here. It's because he supported Strickland's position on those big things. And
Bill, we've talked about when Mayor-elect was on, relations with the council. Mayor Wharton had bad relations with the council for whatever reason. Some would say that's why you had a bunch of candidates. You had Harold Collins and Jim Strickland on there with a vested interest in fighting him. Others would say he didn't attend committee meetings. Others would say there was poor communication. Your take on why some of those essential reasons that there were, for whatever reason, bad relations between the Wharton administration and city council?
Well, Wharton had a fundamentally different and I believe ultimately politically fatal view of the relationship between the mayor and the council. He saw the council, I think, as a barrier or a distraction to a message that he wanted to take directly to people. Well, there's just one problem with that. You have to be able to count to 7 to do the things you want to do because it has to go through the city council. And you can certainly disagree with the council and still prevail politically on election day, but you have to have a discussion with the council. And when you're not physically in the room with them, except on very rare occasions, then that relationship is going to deteriorate.
Yeah. And some would say the vote on Central Station, the big redevelopment down around Central Station, and which will ultimately kind of connect to South City and the public housing project. But the vote to redo Central Station, the movie theater, and all that, which was delayed recently, some month ago, when City Council comes down. They're ready to vote. Henry Turley and others, the developers, are ready to move forward. And there are all these unanswered questions. And council has sort of thrown pens up in the air going, yet again, we don't have questions answered from the administration because it was fairly clear they hadn't gone through the contract. Now, some would say, well, they're on their way out. You got a lot of people looking out the door, moving out the door. But that kind of history, some would say, would happen again and again and again.
Yeah,
the big shiny objects, big projects like you mentioned were announced, and then the follow-through within the administration was rocky.
Well, in this case in particular, the Central Station developers were trying to get construction started before winter set in, so that once you have that period when you can't do a whole lot if the weather turns cold, that they could at least have some things already going and some possibility of some inside work. And what happened was the developers could answer the council's questions, but the council really needed to hear from the administration, the folks in City Hall, about the details of it. And the administration had not looked at the contract for a project that had been on the rails for quite some time.
Well, Bill, I think that another sort of shining example of that is what happened with the Southbrook Mall project in Whitehaven. I mean, you make this big announcement that you're going to provide this grant and these monies to redevelop the building, and obviously you think you understood the viability of the project and whether it was, and then months later you come back and you say, well, no, we're not going to do it, and so it's things like that that really again began to erode not only the relationship of the mayor with the council, but the mayor's relationship with people in the community that said, well, you said you were going to do this, but you didn't do it. And so it's a trust issue. And I think that's really what it boiled down to with both the council and voters. It was about trust.
Let's talk a little bit, it's again in politics and some of these big projects, which, in looking back at 2015, I mean, clearly from a political point of view, and it gets over into the business side of things, Robert Lipscomb leaving. I don't know, I can't remember how much you covered that, but obviously the CA covered it quite a bit. We all covered it quite a bit. And Robert Lipscomb, this tremendous figure associated with a massive change in public housing. 9 of the 10 big housing projects in the city have been transformed into these much better community. I mean, it wasn't smooth necessarily, but much better, much more aesthetically appealing, and so on. Less crime. He is gone from city government. and it was
is.
it was a shock and a shocking story. And we should say he has been accused of some things, but there's still no indictment, right? There's still no arrest.
As of
many
early
many
this
months later. But your take on the fall of Robert Lipscomb?
Yeah, so just a little background. An accuser came forward who accused Lipscomb of statutory rape back in when he was 16 years old, some time ago. And the fallout from that was that Lipscomb resigned from the housing and community development, and is on suspension without pay currently from the Memphis Housing Authority. So that's where the situation is now. No charges have been filed as of early this week. I just spoke to police, and we're still waiting to kind of hear what's going to happen. It's been a long time, and I think Lipscomb's attorney is really going to be starting to push MHA to reinstate Lipscomb. I think he's going to. I think it's going to become a big issue. In the future.
Your take on? I mean, for such a tremendous political figure to fall that way, to fall so quickly, and then for it to be in this limbo is just so strange.
Right, and in a way, this plays to some of the issues that I think have been raised about the police department on a broader level. The police department and the administration undertook this investigation of Robert Lipscomb as soon as this thing surfaced. There's still some question about whether people knew there was this allegation beforehand. But here we are now after the election, and not one word has been said about this in any kind of way. So what is the story? Is his name cleared? Is his name not cleared? What's going on with this? Whatever you think of Robert Lipscomb, and he has been a controversial presence at time. He's been a pivotal figure in the change in public housing in this community. Whatever you think of all of that and his philosophies on all of this, I think that he is certainly entitled to, and I think we as a public are entitled to know what's the status of the investigation.
Because these very horrible accusations are just out there, and it doesn't seem fair to anyone involved but I guess the process needs to take its time. You talked about police, and we've talked about police a number of times. This was a big year nationally, the Black Lives Matter movement, which maybe started, my sense of time gets screwed up, but it's been a huge part of the national conversation in the presidential race, and locally, the shooting of Darius Stewart, and still unclear circumstances. The police department is going to be getting body cameras at some point over the next year, which is going to maybe help the citizens. I can never do it right. CLRB, the
Civilian Law Enforcement Review Board.
Thank you very much. Your take on all that, and I heard people say, Memphis is one shooting, one incident away from a Ferguson moment in protest. Sadly and horribly, that moment came in a way with Darius Stewart. Your sense on where that issue is in Memphis?
Well, I think that Memphis is in a different sort of position. You would think that based upon some of the things that have occurred, that there would have been more of a response from the community, in terms of sort of outcry, outpouring. There have been many protests, but I think Memphis has a history as a protest community, and that even going back to the 60s where we did have some rioting. I think Memphis has really evolved to a place where people can organize and protest and do that in a way that doesn't erupt into some of the other things that we've seen. Clearly, there are some issues around the country, and I always say that sort of Black Lives Matter, the motto, and of course the movement is really born out of the same thing that created the "I am a man" sign. This whole notion that you have to declare that I am human, or that I should be that the humanity in me should be recognized when it hasn't been or had demonstrated based upon some of these police interactions with particularly African American males, and so. I think we'll see that evolve, but clearly at the federal level, state level, I know Congressman Corn is proposing some pretty substantial legislation at the federal level to deal with police shootings and how they're investigated. I think there will continue to be some movement made in terms of even police policy on a local basis, and I think both Mayor-elect Strickland and Tony Armstrong, Director Armstrong, will work to make sure that the policy, because I think even with this situation with Darius Stewart, they're still evaluating whether policy issues were violated by Officer Schilling, and looking at how to enhance the policy going forward.
Yeah, yeah.
At year's end, we know some more about the Darius Stewart shooting thanks to the release of an 800-page Tennessee Bureau of Investigation file on this. And the crucial question in that particular incident, really by the interviews in the file, is whether or not Officer Schilling should have fired the second shot. That's a very critical question here. Black Lives Matter, we had our first demonstrations here in late 2014. Okay. The Darius Stewart shooting was in July here. Yeah. Between those two things, there was a lot that happened nationally, and among the most significant things was a policy shift that was not federal in terms of the federal government being involved, but it was national in scope. Yeah. Our city isn't the only city where new questions are being asked and fundamental assumptions are being questioned about whether police should investigate themselves when these incidents happen. And what's been amazing is how quickly those assumptions have been questioned and how quickly they have changed in what's a relatively short period of time.
I think it'd be interesting too. We had Amy Wyrick, the Shelby County District Attorney, on recently, and TBI being involved, but TBI then can't release, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation can't release its findings, and whether the legislature, which convenes very soon after the show airs, begins to get involved. And it seemed we had Mark Norris and Lee Harris on from the state Senate. It seemed like possibly some changes will happen so that you can have an independent review by TBI, but not have the results be sealed and private, because I think that's part of what everyone's saying is, look, we got to explore this, we got to litigate it, we got to research it, investigate, and everything has to be as transparent as possible. Exactly. It's the same thing with the body cameras and so on. We got about 5 minutes left, and we'll move a little quickly. One thing, I think one of the big stories of next year, which certainly we'll go into, of last year, which we'll go into next year, is just this huge amount of investment. We talked about Bass Pro opening, the IKEA store, which, I mean, some people make fun of, but it is a big bunch of jobs and a big, millions of dollars in investment. We mentioned Central Station, the medical district, Bill. I mean, we've written a bunch. The commercial PI has. You all probably have a huge amount of investment, hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's even before you talk about the $1.5 billion that St. Jude is going to invest. People talking about really a dramatic transformation of Memphis in the urban core, because all this investment is happening in the urban core.
Right, and these announcements in particular with our medical healthcare hospital institutions have really all surfaced right at the end of the year. It's been a real chain of announcements, from St. Jude having permission to open a graduate school, to their announcement several weeks ago that over a period of years they're going to invest about $8 to $9 billion in a transformation of their campus and what they do that is going to have ripple effects far beyond it. What you're seeing are long-held plans that have been thought about since the onset of the recession that had to be sidelined because of the recession, and now they're emerging from it. Memphis came back really slowly from the recession, but we now at least have our head above water on this, and healthcare and the medical institutions have always been the lifeblood of this community. Yeah.
Just a couple minutes left. The biggest, story I missed, well, there are a bunch, but 30 seconds on a story I missed that I mentioned.
I think also Bass Pro, some other developments, Bass Pro, Raleigh Springs Mall, Fairgrounds are some big city developments that are really going to, or some of them are in question. Fairgrounds especially is in question right now. So I think those are things that people want to keep an eye on, because that's going to be...
Yeah, and Mud Island too, the proposal that whether that will have a private investor and that kind of thing. Biggest story or what did I miss? What did we miss so far?
I think we pretty much covered, covered the gamut. I think, interesting is that you see also some of the big commercial projects that you mentioned. There are also residential pieces that are coming back online. The big I think it was an artisan
Yeah.
building that was in foreclosure and then
Right.
vacant for so long, biggest pigeon coop in Memphis, if you will. And now that's being renovated and will be
Yeah.
opening soon. And you see a lot more. You see all the development in downtown there in terms of new apartment buildings that are going up. I mean, I think that it's a positive reflection in terms of the recovery. And I'm hearing positive things from real estate professionals across the city that things are really finally starting to pick up.
With just a minute left, your colleague Kyle Veazey, we talked about the new administration. Kyle Veazey, who been at the CA for however long, is now a part of the Strickland administration. Is he lying to you now? Is he spinning you? Is he deceiving you? How is that relationship going so far?
He hasn't gone over to the dark side just yet, I don't think, to Strickland's dark side. But no, I'm kidding. No, he seems like he's doing well, and I'm looking forward to working with him.
Yeah, and I would say the last couple of things, I had so many things. This was the year that Insure Tennessee died in inglorious death, up quickly after much prep and promotion through much of 2014. I'll be curious if the transportation push that Haslam administration has spent so many months promoting ends the same way. Thank you all for being here. Bill, Ryan, Burnell, thanks. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week.
Yuletide Office Solutions, locally owned and family operated, offering office supplies and furniture, office design services, school supplies, and more. The Yuletide team proudly supports the Bartlett Area Chamber of Commerce and WKNO.